So last summer I took a job in forestry and I was getting back into the field after about 10 years, and things had really changed since the last time I'd been involved. Not that I'd started out in the days of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, although my 13-year-old likes to think probably that these two dudes were my colleagues when I started a couple decades ago. But I actually thought that in the Northwest that logging was still like sometimes a great notion. You know, the Ken Kesey book, set on the Oregon coast with the Stamper family, big burly guys, and they were always guys with chainsaws coming right up next to a tree and cutting it down. But it turns out, before I go on though, I want to say a little bit about logging. So a lot of people think that logging always has to look like this. But fortunately for those of us who care about where our wood and paper products come from, there are other ways of doing it. And the nonprofit that I manage, the Northwest Natural Resource Group, helps people log in other ways, ways that leave the forest looking like this. So there's clean water, carbon storage to protect the climate, opportunities for recreation, and even beauty. And we, thank you. And we certify landowners who manage that way to the standards of the Forest Stewardship Council. There's more than 90 landowners in Oregon and Washington whom we certify with over 150,000 acres. And the water that came from your faucet here in Seattle today came from one of those forests, the Cedar River watershed. But back to logging. I thought that logging was something that happened with a chainsaw and a human going mano a mano with a tree. But what I learned last summer when I started working at this nonprofit is that it's actually a lot more like the Lorax. And you know, the Dr. Seuss book, The Onceler and the Truffula Trees. And that was actually my first introduction to logging when I was a kid, was to read that book. And one of the most alarming things in that book was the super axe hacker that can cut down 4 trees with one smacker. And the thing that I learned when I came to the Northwest Natural Resource Group is that the super axe hacker has actually come to life and is stalking the forests of the Northwest. I greeted this news with some kind of alarm. Now, this super axe hacker takes several forms. It can be called a feller buncher, or in this case, a harvester. And however it is, it's a large machine with a person driving around in a cab, pretty big, pretty expensive, that comes up to a tree, reaches out, grabs the trunk of the tree with its arms, and slices it off at the bottom. But the dirty secret is that watching these machines work is absolutely mesmerizing. So I went to a job that our nonprofit was managing out near Hood Canal, and I sat in the cab of one of these harvesters, and these next few images are from that trip. And I was just absolutely, I couldn't take my eyes off of it. So this machine pulls the log through its jaws, slices off the branches, and then it has to cut it up into log lengths that can be hauled down the highway and sent to the mill. But how does it know where to cut the log, right? The geeks among us will appreciate that it remembers the shape of the last 200 logs that it's cut up. And it optimizes the place to cut those logs into 10s or 12s or 16s, or in this case 26s, so as to get the best revenue for the landowner when it gets to the mill. And then it leaves those logs in piles in the forest. Now, it used to be that you'd have to have a person out there wrap a wire rope or a cable around it and pull it, and so that it could get pulled out by a Caterpillar tractor. Now, someone drives up to it, different jaws grab onto the pile of logs and haul it to the landing where the logs are then hauled to the mill. Now, the other piece of good news that alleviated my alarm somewhat is that those tools can be used for good or less good. So you can still use a harvester or a feller buncher to leave a lot of the trees standing, as we like to do. This is a forest owned by King County. This is the other one that's owned by, that I visited near Hood Canal. And so just because it's a super axe hacker doesn't mean there's a problem. But you might think there's some romance that's lost, right? The logger covered in pitch and sawdust, you know, who maybe finds some wild mushrooms and brings them home for dinner. But consider this fact. Since the early 90s, the number of people killed in logging accidents in the United States has dropped by nearly a half. And the amount of logging that has decreased by just over 20%. And so if we have to give up some romance and some mushrooms so that more people can come home at night to their families, I'd say that's a pretty good trade-off. Thank you very much.